So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Parsha class. So it's actually a double portion this week, Bahar Bechukosai, but the topic of tonight's class comes from the Torah portion of Bechukosai. Now we're going to start off with a quote here. It's from Socrates. It's not exactly found in this week's Parsha, but it's a pretty well-known quote, and I love it. It says, "True knowledge exists in knowing that you know nothing." Now, what does this mean on a practical level? So one, the more a person knows, right? If you actually think that you know everything, like if you believe that you truly are a master at that particular topic that you know, you're closing yourself off from being able to learn anything more, from being able to innovate. Now, this unfortunately has happened to many companies. There were many, many companies that were prominent, huge, larger than life companies that you could not have imagined your life without them. And yet they're gone. They disappeared. I'm just going to bring one. Kodak, right? Palm. There were so many companies that had a huge market share that were at the top of their game, but their CEOs thought that they knew everything and that they thought that they knew everything that there is to know about the topic. And the result is other people innovated, other people moved that category forward, and they failed and they disappeared. So we have this important lesson from Socrates. True knowledge exists in knowing that you know nothing. Right? If you think you know everything, you have a lot coming to you. Now, could you apply this idea to Torah knowledge as well? Now, what do I mean by that? All right. Well, we got that. What I mean like this. Can we assume that there are parts of Torah that we do understand? Can we look at some pieces of Torah and say, this piece of Torah makes sense. This piece of Torah, I know it, I understand it, I fully grasp it. And not only that, this particular piece of Torah information is compatible with secular knowledge as well. Can a person truly say they mastered, they understood, they get it, they grasped this piece of Torah information? Or must everything remain esoteric and beyond our human grasp? Do we need to apply this principle of Socrates, so to speak, that when it comes to Torah knowledge, there's always some element that is somehow beyond us? So of course we go to this week's Torah portion to get some insights. The Torah portion begins, if you follow my statutes and observe them, my commandments and perform them, I will give you rains in their time, the land will yield its produce, and the tree of the field will give forth its fruit. So the Torah is telling us the tremendous reward that is there for a person who observes Torah and mitzvahs, so the person who serves Hashem. Now, it's important to focus on the word. The word says, if you follow my statutes. Now, in Hebrew, the word statutes is Bechukosai. But the word Bechukosai doesn't necessarily literally mean statutes. The word Bechukosai describes one of three different types of mitzvahs. There's Eidos, Mishpatim, and Chukim. Look at this text number 2 from Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher. This is just a little brief biography. So Rabbi Bachya ben Asher ibn Halawa, known as Rabbeinu Bechaya, he was born in 1255. He passed away in the year 1340. He's a biblical commentator. Rabbeinu Bechaya lived in Spain and was a disciple of Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, known as the Rashba. He is best known for his multifaceted commentary on the Torah, which interprets the text on literal, midrashic, philosophical, and Kabbalistic levels. Rabbeinu Bechaya also wrote Kad HaKemach, a work on philosophy and ethics. So he writes, the verse mentions three categories of mitzvahs, namely rational, traditional, and beyond reason. Mishpatim are rational laws handed down to us from God, whereas Eidos are traditional rites that bear testimony to God's presence, and the creation of the world. Chukim are those statutes that do not have any apparent reason. So we know there are three different types of mitzvahs: Eidos, Chukim, and Mishpatim. Eidos are laws that we would not have come up with on our own, but they symbolize things like tefillin, mezuzah, Pesach, things of that nature. Chukim are laws that are not rational, and we never would have, not only would we not have come up with them, but we don't understand them. And mishpatim are laws that make a lot of sense. These three categories of mitzvahs mean that there's going to be a very different mindset, there's a different meditation, there's a different attitude and a focus that we bring to the performance and the observance of each of these mitzvahs. Now, what is the attitude and approach that we bring to observing mitzvahs that are called chukim? Now, mitzvahs that are chukim, of course, are going to be less natural for us to perform. They're going to be a lot less easy for us to perform because we don't understand them. It's much harder to relate to them. It's much harder to connect to them. A person might say they don't even make any sense. Therefore, the Medrash says, this is the statute, chukas, of the Torah, because Satan and the nations of the world taunt Israel, saying, what is this commandment and what purpose does it have? Therefore, the Torah uses the term statute. I have decreed it. You have no right to challenge it. So the Torah recognizes that mitzvahs that don't have an obvious reason are harder for us to observe. Therefore, the Torah calls it a chok. It is a statute. It is a commandment. You have no permission to challenge it, to question it. This is the will of God. That's what a chok is all about. But this leads us to a very important question. Why use the term Bechukosai? You remember that the Torah portion begins that if a person observes Torah and mitzvahs, you're going to be rewarded. But the term that the Torah uses to describe that is Bechukosai. Bechukosai is a very limited definition. It means the mitzvahs that are beyond reason, that transcends logic, that we simply don't understand. Why use such a narrow description to describe a broad spectrum of all Jewish observance? We are rewarded for serving Hashem faithfully the 613 mitzvahs, not just chukim. There's also edus and mishpatim. Certainly we are rewarded for observing edus and mishpatim as well. So what is the Torah trying to tell us by singling out, by highlighting, by using the word bechukosai to define and to describe the attitude that we should have when it comes to observing mitzvahs? So the simple answer, right, that is brought in Hasidic philosophy is that when the Torah is telling us here that the attitude that we should have when it comes to observing mitzvahs is like a chok. A chok means, why am I doing it? I'm doing it because God says so. We should approach all mitzvahs. We should approach every single mitzvah, even if it's logical and rational, as if it was a chok. The motivating factor that we do it is not because it's logical, not because we like it and enjoy it and it makes sense, but rather it is because it is God who commanded it. Every mitzvah for us should be a chok. Every mitzvah should be, for us, should be a faith-based observance of the mitzvah. The way the Rebbe describes it, all mitzvahs, even rational ones, must be fulfilled not only because we appreciate their reasoning, but because they were given at Sinai with a basic sense of commitment. Now, there are two reasons why we should approach every single mitzvah, even the rational ones, like as if it is a chok. All right, so reason number one is that human reason can justify anything. If the whole attitude and approach that we have to serving Hashem is purely based on logic and reason, we can logic our way to anything, we can rationalize our way to anything, we can justify our way to anything. So it's an unhealthy and it's a dangerous approach to our relationship with God to have everything based on purely a foundation of logic and reason, without that recognition that there are things that are beyond my understanding, and I do them just because Hashem says so. That is a profound safeguard for not rationalizing and justifying anything. And number two, it incorporates God into everything. If a person overemphasizes the rational and logical basis to the mitzvahs that they do, you're missing out a key component. Torah and mitzvahs are divine, they're godly, they're holy, they're meant to bring you into a relationship with God. If the focus is on the logical and rational basis, you could very easily miss out from that critical component of what Torah and mitzvahs are all about. Now let's read this in the Rebbe's words. First, if mitzvah observance is predicated on a personal conviction as to their sound logic, it will ultimately lead to a situation our sages describe. Today, your yetzer hara, your evil inclination, tells you to do X. Tomorrow, Y, until you're serving idols outright. To explain, inasmuch as the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, is the one telling you to follow mitzvahs, namely because it makes perfect sense, and not simply because God instructed you to do so, you are essentially unmooring yourself from God. This primes you to thereafter fall ever lower until the abyss of idolatry. Right, we'll deal with this one first. If a person trains themselves that it is only logic and the rational that motivates you to do the Torah and mitzvahs, you end up worshiping logic and the rationale. And again, as we said before, your rationalizations and justifications can take you anywhere, and unfortunately can take you far away from Torah as well. The second reason why we should do every mitzvah as if it's a chok is because mitzvah observance left to rationale alone is missing a critical element of religious life, God. To leave God out of any part of our religious commitment is senseless at best, and as such, everything we do must be undergirded by a sense of blind faith. This does not mean that we're not meant to understand and to rationalize elements of Torah and mitzvahs. Of course we're supposed to. But we also have to make sure that in addition to that, the foundation of our observance of Torah and mitzvahs is faith-based. It's because God commanded us to do so, and therefore we're going to connect to him in everything we do. And the Rebbe continues. Another reason why mitzvah observance must not be predicated on logic and reason alone, even if we argue that the person will indeed fulfill the mitzvahs, they will still lack a critical element, the sentiment that they are something from and connect one with God, a part of Torah. Okay, so far, right, I think everything made sense. We have a very healthy approach to mitzvahs. There are mitzvahs that we don't understand. There are mitzvahs that we do understand. But we have to bring the same feeling, the same sense of commitment and dedication to the mitzvahs that we do understand, just as we do with the ones that we don't understand. Just as the mitzvahs that we don't understand, we know, why am I doing it? I'm doing it because it's a mitzvah from Hashem. So too, we should have that same attitude when we're doing mitzvahs that are even logical and rational. Why are we doing it? Not just because it's logical and rational, because it's a mitzvah from Hashem. However, there's a slight problem in applying this exact interpretation to the word Bechukosai, which we just had at the beginning of the Torah portion. Because the way we translated Bechukosai is that if you follow all of my statutes, etc., you're going to be rewarded. However, Rashi comments that that can't be the meaning of the verse. It can't be the meaning. And in fact, the word Bechukosai in this context actually means studying Torah. That's what it means. It's not referring to the fulfillment of mitzvahs. When the Torah says, if you follow my statutes, it means if you study Torah, then you're going to be getting these rewards. So how do we fit the explanation that we just had, that the definition of a chok is something which is beyond reason, which transcends logic, with the new interpretation that we're talking about Torah? Torah, by definition, is academic. It's logical, it's rational, it's something that a person has to understand. So much so that the Alter Rebbe writes, when studying the oral tradition, if you do not understand what you're learning, it's not considered Torah study at all. If you read a page of the Talmud and you didn't understand what you read, you did not fulfill the mitzvah of studying Torah. The mitzvah to study Torah means I understood. So if the word Bechukosai means to study Torah, and by definition, studying Torah means you must understand, how do we square that away with the classical understanding of the word of Bechukosai, of a chok being something which you don't understand and transcends logic. So we have a huge question. Bechukosai is once again perplexing, considering it is used in the context of Torah study, which is by definition an academic pursuit. So the Alter Rebbe says that in order to understand this, we have to have a better understanding and appreciation of the word chok. So again, in English, we translated the word chok as a statute, but the word chok has another definition as well. The Alter Rebbe writes, the words, if you follow my statutes, Bechukosai, can be interpreted by means of a metaphor from a vessel that needs to be carved out from the inside. So here we're learning a new definition of the word chok, not just a statute in a law, but the word chok means engraved. That's what the word chok means. You are carving out from the inside, like taking a stone, a vessel, you're carving it out. So too we must carve out a space in the animal soul so it can therefore follow, namely to mature to a state of love, to be included in the oneness of God. So what do we see here from the Alter Rebbe? The word chukah means engraving. So when the Torah tells us, "Im bechukosai telechu," if you observe my statutes, what is it referring to? The method and the style of the observance should be like something that is being engraved. Where is it being engraved? It's being engraved on your heart and your soul. If your study of Torah is in such a way that it becomes a part of you, it shapes your identity, it becomes engraved in your character, that is the ultimate reward. When we learn Torah based on faith alone, it carves out a space in our minds and our hearts. Carving out the inside is accomplished through practical mitzvahs of the chukim category, such as para aduma, the red heifer, which have no logical reason whatsoever. This is because these mitzvahs, in fact, stem from a lofty place that is beyond reason. They are the raw will of God himself. Now, that's an incredible line. I'm going to read it again. They are the raw will of God himself. There are some mitzvahs that God gives to us through the lens of logic and reason. God's will is enclosed and integrated in something logical and reasonable. But every once in a while, God gives us a mitzvah that is not enclosed in the garb of logic and reason, and that mitzvah is the raw will of God himself, so much so that we can't understand it, we can't rationalize it, we comprehend it, because it transcends logic. It's the raw will of God himself. And it is through these mitzvahs that flow from such a lofty space that a space is carved out inside the animal soul. The soul is engraved with a love for God, for his or her very soul to be included in the oneness of God through these mitzvahs. So when we recognize that it's the mitzvahs that are not logical, that represent the raw will of God, and we integrate that into our life, we engrave that into our heart, into our soul, it sensitizes us to spirituality and godliness on a whole nother level. It allows us to love God from a much deeper place than reason and logic. By definition, our reason and logic are limited, they are finite. But when we love God from a place within us that transcends reason and logic, the connection is so much deeper and so much more powerful. So therefore, when the Torah says, "In Bechukosai telechu," what does it mean? It means the foundation of our relationship with God and the general approach and attitude that we have towards studying Torah is engraving it in our heart and in our soul. We want it to penetrate our very being, and it's the mitzvahs that are chukim, that represent the raw will of God, that have that great effect. The Rebbe continues, when a person studies Torah with true toil, the type of hard work associated with engraving, as opposed to simply writing, it affects a sense of engraving in the heart of the person who studies it. If he or she suffers from a heart of stone, should they truly toil in Torah, their stony heart will be penetrated by the rigor of Torah. As the verse states, stones that the water eroded. So Bechukosai is a style of studying of Torah, labor, toil, effort. It's not just reasonable. It's not just logical. It's not just rational. You got to really work and toil at it. You labor at it, and that has the ability to sensitize the soul and allow the Torah to penetrate in the most meaningful way. So the approach of Bechukosai is a method of studying Torah where it becomes one with you, it becomes engraved on your soul. However, we still have a problem. It's very nice that the word Bechukosai and the word chakika means engraved, and we should approach Torah study in a way where we try to engrave it on our soul, but we're still left with the problem that the word Bechukosai and achok still means something which transcends region, which transcends logic and reason. However, right, Torah study is something that has to be understood. Torah is something that we have to use our logic and our reason to understand. So it's beautiful, the interpretation of engraved, but how do we fit the idea of engraved with Torah study, which is something which is supposed to be logical and reasonable? Maybe the Torah should have chosen a better word, a different word. What is the message and the lesson of the word Bechukosai? So the Rebbe teaches us that, of course, we have to understand the Torah that we studied. That is Torah study 101. That's Judaism 101. We are obligated to understand the Torah that we study. We are not advocating some type of mystical approach to study Torah where you don't understand anything and you're transcending your own logic and reason. That's not what we're referring to. Absolutely, it's critical when you study Torah, you are meant to understand the Torah. However, there are certain parts of the Torah that we can't understand the reasons behind them. We can understand what to do, we can understand what the law is, but we can't understand what the reason and the logic is beyond that. And we have to bring that into our Torah study. What does that mean? What does it mean when we recognize and we become aware that even within our Torah study, there's a portion and there's an element that trans logic? What does it do? How does it help? Number one, it teaches us commitment. If you do something just because you're in the mood, because you like it, it's appealing or it's attractive to you, your commitment to it is very, very weak. It's very limited, as our mood and what we like and desire can change and can fluctuate. But when a person does something because it's a chok, because it's a law, because it was commanded to us by God, it transcends logic and reason, then we are committed, we are focused, right? It's going to push you beyond your natural tendencies. It's not just something that you do because you're comfortable with it. You're doing it whether you're comfortable or not. Therefore, when a person brings this mindset and attitude that I'm doing it because it's a chok, it's not about reason. You're going to push yourself beyond what you would normally do. Again, we have the Rebbe's words. Bechukosai are the mitzvahs called chukim. In the context of Torah study, this means that our Torah study must be in a chukah-like fashion, namely with raw commitment. While it's true that we must understand Torah with our human intellect, that alone is built on a foundation of faith, namely the drive to understand doesn't flow from personal enjoyment, rather simply because God instructed us that we must understand with our own intellect. Such an attitude leads one to toil in Torah, namely they learn beyond their natural tendency. Motivated purely by personal enjoyment, Torah study would be limited to the contours of what the person enjoys and would never lead to true toil. Again, so the attitude of Bechukosai allows us to push beyond our comfort zone to truly toil, to truly labor in Torah. And then there's another point. When we recognize that the Torah ultimately is a chok and trans logic and reason, we recognize that as much as we understand, as much as we know, it's still beyond us, which allows us to recognize that it's divine Torah, it's transcendent Torah, it's godly Torah. And that when we study Torah, it's not just an academic pursuit, it's a profound spiritual experience. right? That is what Torah is. It's a profound spiritual experience. And as much as we understand, we recognize that we don't understand anything, just as Socrates understood earlier. As much as we understand, at the end of the day, there's something that's called the chok, which transcends logic. Torah is divine, Torah is holy, Torah is godly, not an intellectual experience, but it is a profoundly spiritual experience. In the words of the Rebbe, there are two elements to Torah study. A, studying it with intellectual rigor, and B, the fact that it connects the student with the one who gave the Torah, God, which is the sanctity of Torah. The essence of Torah is that it is beyond our human rationale. If a person assumes that they achieved complete mastery in Torah study, it only demonstrates that they aren't working hard enough. As the previous Rebbe said, even logical parts of Torah must be followed like chukim. Accordingly, it makes perfect sense that the Torah uses the term Bechukosai when talking about Torah study, even though the subject matter is all of Torah, not just the chukim, but also the edus and mishpatim, because when a person toils in Torah study, they come to the realization that even mishpatim are really chukim. So what does this mean on a practical level? What are we learning from the fact that the Torah uses the word in Bechukosai? Let's say you have a bookshelf with wonderful books, fabulous books, self-help books, books that work, books that have good, real, relevant, practical advice to improve your life. But then you also have some books on the shelf. They happen to be Torah books. And in those Torah books, there's also self-help information that's practical, that's relevant, that works. And maybe those ideas even line up. Maybe they're even compatible with those other books that you have on the shelf, the secular self-help books. We have to recognize and we have to realize these books are not in the same category. When we're talking about Torah, it's divine wisdom, it's spiritual, it's godly. And when we study Torah, whether we understand it because it's logical and rational, or whether it transcends our logic, we recognize that through that Torah study, we're connecting to God in the most intimate way, in the most deep way, in the most profound way, and it has to shake us up, right? It has to touch us to our core. We have to engrave it in our heart and our soul. And in that way, it'll have the desired effect, sensitizing us, making us closer, deepening and enhancing our relationship with Hashem, because every part of the Torah, even something you could understand, even something that you might find in a Stephen Covey book, if you read it in a Torah book, it's Torah. It's holy, it's godly, it's a mitzvah, and we connect to him within it. That is the message that we learn from In Bechukosai. Thank you so much for joining us for our weekly Torah studies class. Remember, this is the last week that the class is going to be on Tuesday night. Next week, the classes are going to begin on Monday. The reason for this is because the Shul softball team, the softball season starts on Tuesday. The games are on Tuesday. So I look forward to seeing you all next week on Monday